Good morning from New Mexico. We have our presenters today, LaTasha Armstrong and Karim, and they are giving a presentation on creating school districts acceptable use policies that integrate GenAI and AI literacy practices. LaTasha is a postdoctoral scholar with Promise Learning Science Research Center for Excellence. She holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction, focusing on learning design and technology in early childhood education, and an MS in child development, specializing in administration. Using Black feminism and darkened feminism and Black-oriented theories as her foundation, her work centers on the areas of research about technology and digital media and systems in children's use. Teaching and learning with technology as a tool and a subject area, the development process of digital products, and early childhood and educational policies. Currently, she is a mentee of the Risers Researchers Investigating Socioeconomic Equity and Race Fellowship 2024 cohort. Karim is a senior program manager for the EdTech and Emerging Technologies at Digital Promise. Suna's research has included developing and evaluating digital mental health interventions for adolescents and methods to measure and improve culturally responsive practices in K-12 schools. She supports projects researching how digital tools, emerging technologies can be used effectively, efficiently, and equitably in formal and informal education spaces. Her work prioritizes community voice, co-design, and ensuring the tools that young people use help them represent who they are. Thank you for being here this Saturday, and the floor is yours. Let me share my screen. For some reason, this is... Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go.
While you're setting that up, I'll chime in really quickly. I think a few people are not muted, so just a heads up if you want to confirm you're muted if you intend to be.
This was so much easier to do.
It's always easier when people aren't watching. I I feel that.
Perfect. Thank you for setting that up, Julia. And I guess we can go ahead and get started. And thank you for the introductions as well. So thank you, everyone who is attending today. Amanda, LaTasha, and I are presenting on creating school district acceptable use policies that integrate Gen AI and AI literacy practices. This was done with a cohort of a Gen AI working group with 10 school districts over the course of the 2023 to 2024 school year, and is based on the material supported by the National Science Foundation. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. So this is what we call the RAPID project. This work was led by Dr. Bati Ruiz, who is the Senior Director of EdTech and Emerging Technologies, and was co-supported by myself, as Julie introduced, and Dr. Amanda LaTasha Armstrong. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so a little bit about Digital Promise. Digital Promise shapes the future of learning and advances equitable education systems by bringing together solutions across research, practice, and technology. And I'll share our website in the chat before I turn it over to Amanda LaTasha.
Great. Thanks, Sana, for the intro and setting the tone. If you could go to the next slide. Um, so Sana briefly shared that this is a part of the RAPID project. And so as stated, this is a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation. And over the course of the 2023-2024 academic school year, we partnered with 10 school districts from the League of Innovative Schools, which is a part of a Digital Promise project, which is a national network of school districts that connects and support the most forward-thinking leaders in education. So we partnered with 10 school districts, 11 persons total, to work on revising school districts' existing policies in consideration to generative AI and emerging technologies. Next slide.
Sorry, there's a delay on my end and I don't know what else to do.
It makes us just take our time. And so I'm also noticing the questions. If people have questions, people have already started as they are thinking about them, because we'll have time at the end to respond to some of the questions and just to also engage in conversation, because you all may have responses because you all are doing this work too. Then we can have that kind of conversation. So this is an overview of the school districts that we have, just to kind of state that it's from different communities throughout the states, and that, and they also range as far as socioeconomic status as well as student population. So we try to be mindful of thinking about like the settings that the school districts were, and just kind of giving them time to really kind of think about how does this apply, and how does revising their generative AI and school district policies kind of apply to these different contexts. Next slide.
Great. So this one is me. So before we get into what we found in our collaboration with the working group that Amanda described, we just want to give a brief definition about artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. The definition you see on the left is the one that is defined in the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and the use of AI, coming from the White House, that was released last year. So they define AI as a machine-based systems that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions. They use both machine and what we want to emphasize as human-based inputs to perceive real and virtual environments. The definition you see on the right is for generative AI. This comes from the glossary of artificial intelligence that was developed by Dr. Bate Ruiz and Dr. Judy Fusco. I will link both of these into the chat as well, but they define generative AI as the class of AI models that emulate the structure and characteristics of input data in order to generate derived synthetic content. So example of this can include images, videos, audio, text, and other digital content. Next slide, please. And then we also define acceptable use policy, which we may refer to as AUPs throughout the course of this presentation. These provide staff, learners, parents, school community members, and others in the school community ecosystem with guidance and supporting information to ensure the appropriate use of technologies, systems, and tools. So AUPs most likely already exist in most school districts, including policies about using social media in schools, downloading apps and media, what is and what is not okay to use when using school technology and internet. We will also maybe referring to this as responsible use policies, or RUPs, in our conversation with the generative AI working group. We've learned that many are starting to adopt this term to emphasize that need for human voice and agency when using emerging technologies and how to use them ethically. Next slide, please. So going back to the kind of work we've been doing with the district leaders and our researchers and co-learning together with this work, we just wanted to share briefly some of the research activities we did. So we held monthly GenAI working group meetings to hear about their progress, questions they had, We know that understanding AI and the speed at which it's moving is very quick and rapid. So just seeing how people are adjusting in real time. We also encourage community conversations, which we will be talking a little bit about later in the form of empathy interviews. We requested that the working group speak to members of the community, see their understanding of AI. We also held focus groups on very specific topics such as equity and the kinds of deliverables they were looking for, and had individual one-on-one conversations. And then we also asked them to share documents and resources with us to see that what they were using, what they were seeking out, and how we can use that to build the kind of materials that we can share with other school districts who may be doing similar work. Next slide, please.
To give a little bit of insight of what they learned. So we'll share just some of the conversations that they had. So they had community conversations where they would meet with and discuss kind of topics related to GenAI and AI with teachers, students, and district leaders. And here are just some of the points that they noted during our conversations together. Next slide. So with teachers, they noticed that there were conversations about ethical issues in regards to AI, and thinking about that along with having a desire to have training around AI and GenAI. They also were excited about its potential to increase efficacy and save time on planning, writing, and researching. And again, also, while there was some trepidation and hesitation, teachers were interested in embracing new ways to engage their students. Next slide. For students, there was a mixed understanding of how generative AI would work well, and how might it have some potential downsides of using it. So some potential things that they should consider and be concerned about. Students also felt that teachers were moving too slowly in terms of talking about Gen AI, incorporating it, thinking about AI. And they were also experimenting with AI, but they weren't exactly clear about how to use it effectively and legitimately. Next slide. And for community members, there was concern about job replacement in terms of AI and generate AI, the perpetuation and amplification of biases in society, kind of what we were talking about before we started this session, as well as privacy and security of data. Members also were acknowledging that there could be a divide between the way students who can effectively use AI and compared to those who may not have the same kind of knowledge and experience and skills with that. And then community members also wanted students to be prepared for the world that is changing rapidly. Next slide.
Great. So what does all this mean? What do we do with all this information? So with these conversations, with these various research activities, we developed 6 guidance topics. So if you go to the next slide, we'll present an overview of them. Again, these are based on the findings of activities of different members within the GenAI working group. And we also include references to the EdSafe AI Safe Framework and Digital Promises AI Literacy Framework, which the latter we will talk about a little in this presentation as well. Next slide, please. So the 6 topics that we focused on and provide as key guidance topics to include and recommend to include in AUPs and RUPs are AI literacy, safety, ethics, transparency, implementation guidelines, and evaluation impact. So I'll go briefly and talk about each one and its purpose and what it can do in an AUP and RUP for generative AI. Next slide, please. So some considerations when developing policy content, you'll see about 6 bullet points about what districts should keep in mind before jumping into developing policy content. As we've been sharing throughout, and I feel like something that's been a theme throughout is that humans must always stay in the loop. We'll talk about various ways that humans are like people in the school district can get involved. And something we also really want to acknowledge is that everyone comes in with different starting points and understandings about AI and generative AI. So no one is an expert on it. Again, it's moving so quickly that it's hard to keep up. And when it comes to implementing these, it really takes time. So instead of just jumping into the shiny new object and purchasing it and putting it into systems, it's important to work together, take the time, and understand again that everyone comes in with different understandings and access to these tools as well. Similarly, because everything is moving so quickly, there should always be a plan to frequently update the AOPs. That is easier said than done, especially when the workload in a school district can be very overwhelming. But if these are tools and emerging technologies that people are really keen on using, especially young learners, as we know that young people, especially teens, are very much the first group of people to start using technologies right away. It's important to make sure that these policies try to update in time with that. Again, and then adopting instructional methods for AI integration. For example, AI is not just a grading tool. It can be used to create learning experiences that develop creativity and critical thinking. One of the key takeaways we got from our working group is that they're really starting to reconsider what it means to teach in the classroom. It's difficult because most schools have to teach to the test, have to teach to meeting certain standards. And because of those more template-based approaches, it's easier for young people to turn to AI tools. So understanding how learning experiences can be more creative and have involved more critical thinking. We also recommend introducing policies with a position statement and to prepare to create student-centered AUPs. So I know we received a couple of questions about student voice and agency. So we recommend also developing acceptable use policies that are really focused specifically for the students. Next slide, please. So, okay. So speaking really briefly about the student-centered acceptable use policies, we recommend condensing these into 10 or fewer main points. Again, keeping things simple, straightforward. We know that especially when people won't consume a long piece of text. I don't think most people do, but again, just keeping everything to key points. Craft the language so that learners assume responsibility for their actions. We really wanted to be very active based, and again, keeping that sense of agency instead of them being told what to do. So starting sentences with some things like I am responsible for. We also recommend developing age-appropriate AUP models, such as a glossary and a quiz that educators can use in their classrooms, and then to work with interested high school learners to assist in developing grade-level appropriate public service announcements. Again, finding ways to really get the students involved, and again, developing those agentic skills and opportunities for them to feel like what is being shared with the district really represents what they want. Next slide, please. Great. So again, I will touch very briefly on each of the 6 topics. AI literacy is really foundational to the work. Again, we'll be talking more about this with the digital promise framework later in this presentation, but we define AI literacy as developing the media literacy, digital literacy, and critical thinking skills to understand the safest and most ethical use of AI for learners, educators, and the district as a whole. So basically, before even jumping into using AI, what are the skills that we need to keep in mind to ensure that it's being used ethically, effectively, and equitably? Next slide, please. The second one is safety. This prioritizes protecting student, teacher, and community data and privacy while managing potential cybersecurity risks. This was really key for us because we don't want to just focus on data protection, but also what people need to keep in mind when putting information into these AI tools. It's really important that especially students and teachers understand that they're not just putting information about themselves, most likely, they're also putting information about the people around them. So keeping in mind things such as data sovereignty and what people own about the information about themselves and how that may or may not be used without their consent. So keeping some guidance language about that as well. Next slide, please. So similarly with ethics, emphasizing the need to be responsible, fair, and equitable, and acknowledging the biases in both human and the synthetic outputs of generative AI. I think we talked a little bit about this before we started the talk today, but not just about the fair use of using AI, but just thinking about what gets generated out, how it might affect the student, how it might affect the teacher, what's generated back. Also similarly thinking about how whatever the output is can affect the behaviors that people may have with each other. So for example, how those with learning disabilities or people of color may more likely be flagged as cheating when they are not, and how that can affect the relationship between the teacher and the student. Next slide, please. Transparency is just being open about the processes that yourselves, educators, and learners use when selecting generative AI tools for your schools, and about the development and changes in your guidance. So some things we have seen is that the AUPs to mention how and when a generative AI tool was used in an assignment, the teachers being honest about if they're using AI to grade a system, for those in the school district and at the high, like as a leader position, acknowledging the process, what it means to procure an AI tool and why they did it. So including some kind of language about that in the policies. Next slide, please. Implementation guidelines include professional learning supports and guiding language and the ways that educators, learners, and community members can implement generative AI tools to generate results that are safe and effective. And then next slide. Finally, evaluation and impact. So what are the skills and what are the guidelines that students and teachers can have to evaluate the AI systems in an ongoing way, as well as the impact of their use? Districts should continue to ask themselves if the tools are beneficial or causing harm. So for example, in an AOP, there could be guiding language about whether they see the output as successful, or if what they see as what's being generated back at them can actually be used for their assignment or not. So again, building the skills and tools so they understand when it is best and most effective to use AI tools in their assignment or grading, and when it's not, or maybe even harmful. Next slide, please.
Now we'll talk specifically about some of the strategies that districts apply when learning with their communities. And we want to also acknowledge that these may already be existing in your community, that you already may be talking to your
Alexa,
community.
what's my notification?
One new notification. From Amazon. U.S. National Weather Service has issued an area of flood advisory.
Based on the cultural experience. And so just to be aware that these are strategies you may already be doing, and really this may give you some insight of maybe how to incorporate AI into some of your existing practices. Next slide. So developing and implementing an AI task force was really effective for the district leaders. So for an AI task force, that was anyone within the school ecosystem. So that could include community members, learners, educators, guardians who are a part of the school ecosystem. And what they did was, like, how they implemented it was the district leaders needed to secure resources in order to raise awareness and empower others to become learners about AI and generative AI. So then even within the AI task force, everyone is learning together. And it could include assigning a team or an individual with the role of keeping up with emerging technologies and AI and its development, with the assumption that learners have access to AI and will use AI tools, and also assumptions that with sufficient guidance and support for educators and learners alike, AI can have benefits for education. So it's about kind of like having like a whole kind of perspective into different lenses of how AI can be used, and inviting members of the community to be a part of that and engage in that conversation, which is really similar to what was kind of stated during the keynote session. Next slide. So what are some best practices for AI task force? So acknowledging that everyone is at different stages of experience and use, and they have different entry points. So not necessarily privileging people based on like, I am an expert and I have background in this, but really like allowing everyone to feel like they're a part and they have something to offer and something to value as members of the task force. That it's also about cultivating equitable technology space and reducing barriers that hinder participation. So that could be related to like language or jargon, that people don't feel like once they're in the task force that because they don't have a certain kind of understanding of language that that they can't be included, but that everyone again has value and input. Also, thinking about for practices, sharing information and updates and reason for policy updates, balancing the urgency of meeting kind of the needs of AI with intentionality. So like finding that kind of sweet spot for the community, collective producing scenarios and use cases that are relevant to the community that would happen, so that there's kind of something tangible that they can relate to, that like the whole community ecosystem can relate to, the whole school ecosystem can. And also focus on adult use initially and then other audiences. It helped them to just kind of chunk for a sense of focusing on like working with adults and working with teachers, and then connecting it to other audiences. But as again, like, you know, I would recommend adjusting it based on the interests of your community and just kind of how your community's own flow. Next slide. For empathy interviews, which Sana mentioned earlier. So just to give context about empathy interviews. So empathy interviews of design process focuses on understanding experiences, emotions, and motivations of others to learn about their needs of users for like whom you're designing it for, and then also understanding the learners with whom you are working with in order to help identify their needs and design for those needs. So really it's about, you know, having those conversations, really understanding where people are coming from and all the different ways in which they're responding to to a particular instance. Next slide. In the context of empathy interviews in the classroom, so this is where from the Learning Variability Project within Digital Promise, and Patti was a part of, you know, helping to define and describe, you know, what empathy interviews are. And so in the context of classrooms, they're open-ended conversations with a predetermined protocol that helped educators build relationships with learners and understand learners' needs, their identities outside of the classroom, and then how those identities intersect with learners' school experiences. So this is similar to what we were talking about in terms of thinking about like the identities that students have and how like using technology or so like impacts them. So really kind of having those sorts of understandings about how those identities are brought into the classroom. And then an educator will ask questions and figure out ways in which they can support the learners in achieving specific goals. In the context of interviews, empathy interviews, and AI task force, it really involved like learners, educators, community members bringing their whole selves when talking about using technology. And these empathy interviews like help district leaders understand users' experiences with technology, so their community members' experiences with technologies, the reasons they do or do not use technology in certain kinds of ways and certain kinds of technologies, and then how users feel technology will affect their quality of work. Next slide.
Great. So before we close the presentation, we did want to spend some time talking about AI literacy, as we referred to earlier in this presentation. So even though we have it as a guidance topic, we think it is important to set as a foundational concept before jumping into using AI tools as a whole and really thinking about the other components, especially because the other components really branch off of AI literacy. So if you go to the next slide, we define AI literacy as the knowledge and skills that enable humans to critically understand, use, and evaluate AI systems and tools to safely and ethically participate in an increasingly digital world. So if you look at the two frameworks at the bottom, they're the same. The left is in English and the right is in Spanish. But it really is a combination of understanding how to use, understand, and evaluate AI tools, but really being rooted in human judgment and centering justice. So I'll share this in the chat as well. We also have some QR codes at the end, and this is one of the links included, but you can hear more information, read more information about AI literacy and our AI literacy framework that was led by Bhati and Kelly Mills. If you go to the next slide. So part of our core messaging when it comes to the AI literacy framework is understanding that, again, we know AI is moving quickly. We know that people feel a need to catch up or stay up to date about these tools and understand how to use them and make best judgments about them as quickly as possible. But something we want to reiterate is that AI literacy skills are not new. They are built on existing literacy skills that may or may not already be taught in schools. And these include things as like media literacy, so the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication, digital readiness, and 21st century skills, so thinking critically, behaving safely, and participating responsibly in the digital world, and computational thinking skills, so solving problems systematically so that a computer could support the process of product development. So again, we just really want to reiterate that AI literacy skills are not a new set of skills. They just branch off of existing literacy skills and readiness skills that are most likely already taught in schools and practiced for students to learn. Next slide, please. This is a little small, so hopefully I can try to read this as best as possible. But some practices that we want to keep in mind when it comes to this work is the various kinds of practices and ways that people can build AI literacy skills off of them. I'll just read the items that are on the left-hand column. So that can include algorithmic thinking, abstraction and decomposition, data analysis and inference, data privacy and security, digital communication and expression, ethics and impact, and information and misinformation. So again, you'll see all these skills already being taught and practiced, most likely in most school curriculum, but also seeing how these can also be reflected in those guidance topics that we shared about earlier. And you can read more information about this in the link that I just shared about the AI literacy framework. Next slide, please. So just to give an example, oh, go ahead. I forgot it was you.
To give an example of how the working group connected to AI, the AI literacy. So as Sana mentioned, there are these three components. So one of them is AI in terms AI literacy and evaluation. And so how that showed up in an acceptable use policy was one district had these 2 points. So one was to ensure students are future ready. Students should learn to evaluate if and how they should use AI and develop responsible and ethical practices when using AI tools. Another point mentioned in this AUP is that students should use AI tools with the guidance of trusted adults, and students should evaluate the purpose of safety and trustworthiness of AI tools before use. Next slide. And then in terms of evaluation, this is also from the AI literacy framework that Sana mentioned that you could reference, but this is just one example of how evaluation showed up in practice. So this was in regards to one school having, for the high school, is having misinformation night, which combined media literacy and use that in terms of looking at AI and then examining and evaluating online information. So still using practices that were already existing in the school and then incorporating AI. Next slide. Another point of AI literacy and the working group in AUPs was through use. And one example of how this showed up in an AUP is one district had the following notes. So generative AI may be used to gain clarity on academic content, for the planning elements of academic tasks, such as gain inspiration, ideation, brainstorming, organizing, structuring, etc. For drafting the first version of work for an academic task, and to gain feedback for making improvements to the clarity or quality of work to improve the final product. Next slide. An example of AI literacy use and practice. And so in this context, one school district already had computational pathways and having computational learning experiences. And then they embedded AI in a different curriculum. And then they provided examples for how it can be embedded in language, math, social studies, and science. And so already using what was already established and then incorporating AI in an intentional way. And again, refer to the AI literacy framework for more for reading more about that particular example. Next slide.
So that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening in. I know we shared a lot of information, but if you look at the QR codes at the bottom, the one on the left is the AI literacy link I just shared in the chat. The one in the middle is a synthesis of all of the information we presented with our work with the Generative AI Working Group, and a guidance language deck. So it goes into more detail about those 6 topics, examples in research and in practice, and in the district's AUPs that they provided to us. And then the one on the right is reading about a blog post that we wrote back, I think in April, about what district leaders are learning from their communities. So more detailed information about those speech bubbles that we shared in the beginning of the presentation. Next slide, please. These are just some references, and then just some more information about how we can best use these slides and how to cite the information that we shared. So I think that concludes our presentation for now, if you want to take some questions.
So I noticed some in the chat that we may have answered. So one about the AUP teachers and students. So I think we provided an example of that. If anyone has a follow-up about that, let us know. We also, and we can both respond to this. So the question was, can you touch on acceptable use in a variety of school settings as well as school types, urban, suburban, rural? Are there differences we need to note? I'll let Sana take that. I mean, first, we kind of talked about that a little bit, but we can both offer input on that one.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can start. So something that we also need to acknowledge is that not everyone has different starting points and entry points. Similarly, no two districts are the same, and the access to the materials that districts have may also differ, especially when it comes to digital access, broadband access, and so on. Um, Although we try to make it as universal as possible, we also understand that the contexts are different. While we can really speak to the specifics on the differences, I don't know, Amanda, if you may have a couple examples, that's why we reiterate working directly with your community through the task forces and working groups, through the empathy interviews, to understand what access the general demographics and population of the school district has, and how that can be adjusted to meet the context of the district's needs.
I mean, I agree with everything Sana says. And just to add to that, I think that they're also finding like commonalities between them. So for instance, like broadband, which people typically associate with only a rural issue, is also an issue in certain places within urban environments, or like how people and what people can access technology tools were similarities. So as they were also noticing distinguishing factors between their communities, they were also noticing that there were similarities based on like the historical like sort of circumstances of of like a particular context. And so like those were also interesting things where people in rural and urban districts didn't necessarily understand that they would have similarities, but then like in talking with each other, we're understanding that there were some commonalities as well as particulars.
Yeah, and I'll quickly add too, I think because of the different kinds of localities, it's also important to reiterate that because what a learner or student might have available at home differs depending on the family and depends on other contexts, to understand how these acceptable use policies should also consider the work of their community. So for example, how libraries are using theirs and working with them, because students may be going to their libraries outside of the school to access information, other community centers that they may be turning to. So keeping those into account as well.
Another question, if we want to elaborate on, is how can teachers use their voice to be involved in policy issues in their classrooms and in districts? For example, if a district is creating policies, are teachers being involved in those discussions? Which I think we touched on when we were talking about the community conversations that the district leaders had, and just giving examples of that. Sana, did you want to elaborate on any points?
Yeah, so I think the empathy interviews is a good example of how to structure those conversations, and the task force, again, depending on the needs of the district, is an opportunity to either have like a teacher focused working group. I know some of the districts we talked to did that. Others would do a combination of community group members, so teachers, leaders, parents, and so on. Something I always want to reiterate too is that what we noticed, and I think Amanda had mentioned it, is that teachers are the least likely to be accepting of using AI tools in their classroom. So thinking about the various interests and hesitations that teachers have about AI, and not just the ones who are most excited about it. So making sure you get a representation, not just of teacher, like how long they've been teaching for, the other demographics, but also their interest, their lack of buy-in, and so on, to make sure that as many voices are represented. And that can come from a various ways of entry, such as compensation, other forms like professional, as a source of professional development, and so on. So those are just a couple of things that we've noticed.
Yeah, you answered that. Well, can I take the last one, Julia? Yeah. Okay. I'm monitoring the time. I know we have 1 minute. Can you speak to application of monitoring of student use of AI in line with school guidelines? Is it hope we can give students access and voice while keeping them safe in using AI tools? And I know Sana and I both have responses to that. I'll let Sana go first.
Yeah, so I'll start on that really quickly. So I'm very big on student voice, and similar with the discussion about teachers, something I always want to reiterate is that students who usually get involved in these sorts of opportunities for agency and providing their voice are usually those who are high performing. And I know we also mentioned that in our deck, but something we also want to keep in mind is how those who have fewer access to resources, those who may be turning to AI tools potentially as a source of cheating because they don't have the time, they don't have the other resources to provide the ability to complete their assignments effectively. How do we get them involved to understand why they're using AI tools, what their feelings are about it? I think we had also mentioned about how students can also not just be involved in the development of maybe student-centered AUPs, but also sharing out that information with their student body. So I just generally think it's important to get them involved as soon as possible, as early as possible. Again, they're the ones who are using these technologies first and adapting to it the quickest. So it's important to try and work with them as much as possible about how they're using it and not just speaking to them about what they can and can't do, because young people are most likely going to do the opposite of what people in authority are most likely going to tell them to do. So how do we listen and work with them instead of talking to them?
And also just considering like what, as Sana was mentioning, like the high performing, like making sure like there's a coherent like diversity among students in their different lived experiences, their different cultural experiences that they can bring to the conversation, and really being mindful like of how they're invited into that conversation. So thinking about multimodal ways in which they can express themselves, and then also thinking about the age group as well. So like, yes, students as for monitoring and then getting them involved, and then like the approach of getting like multiple different perspectives on that in the process, and then making it iterative and meaningful, so that and like actually incorporating their ideas so that they know they're actually being heard.
Thank you guys so much for your presentation. This was really insightful, and we're so grateful for you to take time out on your Saturday to come and present for us. So I hope that all the audience members took away as much as I did. Yeah, and so our next session is starting at 11:15. You have a few minutes for a small break, and then choose where you want to go next. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.